Adapter.
Yeah.
Alright, go ahead, Ellie.
Thanks. I don't know how to do this. Sorry. Oh my, this is idiotic. Why? Why do I leave countries without like? There we go. Are you guys filling out the thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. What motion are we? There we go. Is it starting? Is it like playing already or flipping?
Yes, let's check it.
Oh, this thing?
Yeah.
It is on live. It's live.
It's on.
Oh, yeah, cool.
Okay.
It's on.
Do people know you said that? It's been on the whole time.
Oh, yeah. That's fine. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to round 3 of this year's APU Open. To remind us before we begin, please put your phones on silent or please turn them off. Points of information are highly encouraged. And if you speak with your teammate, please go at a minimum volume so as to not disrupt the speaker currently speaking. I will be timing you guys, but I cannot promise that I will be able to religiously clap, so it would be good if you guys can, time yourselves as well. On the motion that this House would allow media practitioners to report on national crises only if they disclose their sources, we invite the Prime Minister to speak for the motion that stands.
Excuse me for being poetic, but the quiet before the storm, that calm, not so calm, brooding moment of ambiguity before the flood or the typhoon hits, where you know something's going on, but you don't really know what's up. When there are a bajillion micro-bloggers on Facebook saying one thing, a state-owned media company saying another, and a bajillion other broadcasters in free media movements saying other things, you as an individual don't know who to believe. You're paralyzed by this huge influx of information that's coming in. Mind you, unsourced information that you have no idea whether or not is credible. Because in everyday life, information is not as crucial as it is in national crises. Even if something is unsourced and incredible, not incredible as in outstanding, but incredible as in not entirely true, it doesn't affect people's lives tremendously, more than it alters their conceptions of things. But in national crises, we're talking about floods that could potentially displace people. We're talking about a decision-making calculus where people decide to leave their homes and families and jobs to move to a neighboring state to avoid a potential flood that may or may not be coming. In national crises, things now more than ever rely on information, and they rely on legit, credible information. We cannot guarantee information is credible, but what side proposition wants to do today, later, is prove that at the very least, an individual has the full dimensional view of the information he's receiving, so at the end of the day, it's in his hands or her to decide what they are going to do with that information. What are we not okay with? We're not okay with censoring. We think at the end of the day, media companies will report what they will report, later my friend, but governments at the end of the day have a say in when these reports do come out. Governments have PR strategies and how they manage their countries and the people on the ground, so they can say when reporting happens and when it doesn't. But here's the thing, if there's a flood, then there's a flood. This debate happens in ambiguity, where we don't know if a flood is coming or not. So I'm going to talk to you about how sources play a huge part in helping you make decisions in regards to what kind of information you're receiving from whom. Before that, anybody?
Okay. If this is just talking about times of floods, why do people have an incentive to want to withhold their identity or prefer being anonymous if it's like a national crisis?
Exactly. If you have a credible source of information, if you have a video camera videotaping a current onrushing storm to a city, then you're not going to want to cover yourself up. We're not talking about instances, we will never, individuals generally don't have an incentive to remain hidden because the flood's not going to come and strike them back. You know what I mean? The reason unsourced information happens is we allow media companies way too much power to say what's right and what's not. They don't even think it's important to let their people know where they got that information because they take it for granted that it's their right to publish what they want whenever they want. People, if they are correct, are unlikely to not come forward, and if they don't come forward, then that already shows you that there's something dodgy about that individual, and that is already a natural litmus test to avoid bad information. So in this case, that can never occur because you know if you are a dodgy source, if you are doing it just for the publicity, if you're like me and you want to be on TV and you go and report that I'm a witness of the 9/11 or whatever, you're not going to do that if you know you don't have credible information. So in a way, we avoid people coming forward with nothing to say. We ensure, and that feeds on later about how it's important to regulate what sources and when. Later. So, sources play a part. There's this wonderful Ghanaian proverb where if the frog tells you a crocodile is dead, believe the frog. If a deer says the same, discount it. It comes to the credibility of the source. Because essentially this, if you're a person and there are two channels that you're watching, one of them tells you about an oncoming flood. The report is by the Department of Meteorology, and it's a well-detailed, informative news review. And the other channel is about some local fisherman or some wizard by the beach that says the stars are a bit off today, and there's likely going to be a flood. At the end of the day, you need to know who said that before you can decide whether that information is true or not. So if you knew that it was a random fisherman on the ground that talked about the oncoming flood versus the meteorology department of your country, that allows you to discern whether or not that information is important to you. If it was a fishery bomo, it's easy for me to say that might or might not happen, I can discount it. But if it was more credible source, that makes the information more important and make you more likely to act on it. So sources play a big part in adding this critical dimension in the news. It tells you how heavy that piece of information is. So in a way, having that little byline at the bottom of the article that says this was by people on the ground, or this was by this NGO, or this research body, adds huge amount of value to how much we can believe that information. And that's important because you need to act on this information. Because if the meteorology department told you a flood is oncoming, you need to move, and you need to move fast. But if a fisherman told you such, maybe you don't have to abandon everything and run away on what could be a false claim at the end of the day. So we need to add this new dimension to add to the news, so you're more likely empowered to make decisions later. But if you are a fisherman and you are unsure about your sources, you just think a flood's coming up, there's no possible rational calculus of that fisherman going to a media company and saying, I think a flood's coming up. Because everybody knows it's going to be him that says it. So If that flood doesn't come, you already know that's an incredible source. I don't know why I keep saying incredible, not credible source that you're going to discount in future all the time. But if a legit NGO or a Department of Meteorology were to come forward or some credible source and prove itself, if they told you something is going to happen, and they came forward because they were very sure of what they saw, they were very sure of their sources, the sources of the sources, and they came forward and put that out there, then if that was proved true, that allows people to trust in that source a little bit more. In the end, sources play a big part in how information is perceived, and we need to put that information out there so people can perceive information in the way they want to perceive information. Because remember, unsourced information is dangerous. If you don't know what to believe, you don't know what to act on, and you're likely not to act. And if you don't act, if you don't do something, that could be extremely harmful to you. If you discount all the media you hear and you don't move, the flood hits, you're screwed. If you take into account all the media you hear and you run away, the flood doesn't hit, you're also screwed. You need to be in a position to know which information you should consider and which information you should act on. And ultimately, unsourced things are dangerous because in that ambiguity, you're not only paralyzed into indecision, but you're likely to make wrong decisions. So at the end of the day, what we're fighting for is better news reporting, more dimensional news, especially in a time where information is so critical. At the end of the day, remember, it's a context in national crisis, and there are certain things we have to do differently. Thank you.
Okay. We thank the Prime Minister for his speech. To open the case for the opposition bench, we invite the opposition leader.
Message from Mama. Your mom just messaged. When we're talking about national crises, we think it's rather unfair to limit it to just times of natural disasters. We think that it should encapsulate the entire spectrum of things as compared to things like financial meltdowns, government scandals when it comes to public policy. So things like the missing plane of the MH370 would also qualify under these scenarios anyway. The stance of side opposition is fairly simple. We think that anonymity is a fair trade-off for making sure that people are willing to come up and reveal sensitive information, especially in areas like this, to make sure that we can hold governments and politicians accountable for their actions, especially in a climate of uncertainty. Before I go on to my arguments proper, let's deal with the incredibly narrow case that side government has come up here to set up. So their entire Prime Minister's speech was about what happens if there's a flood and there are too much of information to begin with. A couple of rebuttals. The first thing they came up here and said is information is largely, if there's too much of information, it confuses people into making bad choices, and that can largely be harmful for them. One, when it comes to times of flood, informations are largely not sensitive or pertain to national security anyway, so that people don't have a reason to remain anonymous in times like this. So you're not going to have difficulty in finding people who want to be your sources of information, simply because many people are more than willing to come up and be the sources for information for newspaper, news media corporations to want to be able to report them anyway. What is the implication of this? Because identification becomes so simple in a time where there really is no reason for me to remain anonymous. The problem is, one, your problem of access information will happen anyway, because news corporations will find it significantly easier, or will find it just as easy to be able to find people to verify the kinds of reports that you generally have. So in terms of the number of quantity you have of reports that are surfacing on media, that doesn't really change. The reason why they've made this fundamental error is because they've largely conflated the problem of identification with reliability and credibility of the information that's generally reported anyway, which means under their model, newspaper corporations would tell you this was by Fisherman Jack or Fisherman Joe, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they would not continue reporting the information, or they would not cause the same amount of paranoia that it caused within status quo. So we don't think the model really changes anything under their side. We don't think it provides a more streamlined, credible avenue for information. We sure as hell don't think it solves the problem they've come out to do. But the third thing is, even if we're talking about in times of floods, we think it's cruelly inhumane that you're forcing news corporations, and this is assuming but not conceding, that it takes a really long time for us to be able to report, and so that's how we streamline more accurate news information. We think the priority in times like this is to make sure we can get as much information out there as possible, considering that no one really has an incentive to skew information against the welfare of the public and allow for people to assume worst case scenarios so that they can move themselves out of immediate dangers in times like that. Because the worst case scenario of your model is news corporations are unable to report, assuming of course, are unable to report and provide any forms of information to the public that leaves them largely stranded without the kinds of things they need to prepare themselves in times of natural disasters to begin with. So we'd rather have more information out there for people to be able to access and make choices, at least the most safest choice possible, where you err on the side of caution, rather than have not have the kind of expediency in providing information to the public, which we think is largely important for these individuals to make sure that they're safe anyway. So all in all, even if you were to believe the one-dimensional problem that side government sets out, I struggle to see how the policy makes it any different, any better, and we think even if there was a problem with too much information, the priority must go to expedient information that reaches society, rather than it does just making sure that we have the veracity of how, like, what kind of miles per hour is the tornado hitting, or how many hours is the tsunami going to come. We think it's more important for people to know the tsunami is coming right now. And so, before I move on to my arguments proper, yes sir.
Okay, your setup that consists of political scandals being included in national crises will not be a part of it. We don't think that's necessarily a part of it, but even if it was, that's why we have the witness protection program. The point is that in times of panic, why is it okay for us to possibly believe lies that are unsourced and uncredible?
We're telling you, okay, I already told you that in the two scenarios that this debate could possibly take place in the scenario of things like floods, the lies would happen anyway, something that you didn't bother disputing in your POI. And two, we don't think anyone has an active interest to lie against the welfare of humanity to make sure that they die. So we'd rather make sure that there's more information that's out there rather than risk not having any information at all. As regards to things like political scandals and sensitive information, I'm going to go into my arguments right now. We're looking at sources that remain in one, and the motion slightly assumes that there are people who want to remain anonymous. That's the moral dilemma of whether or not we should have such preconditions to begin with. We're looking at people of interest who work in industries who are very sensitive in nature. The kinds of relevant industries where people have the information to reveal, then they have the credibility of being able to provide the information as to government inaction or government cover-ups to begin with. Media has a specific kind of, the media practitioners have a specific interest in who they want to look out for, because they want the information to be credible, and they want the first movers advantage of the kinds of controversy they provide in areas like this, aka situations like the MH370 anyway. Two conclusions to this is, one, the kind of sources you do get are largely credible because media practitioners have an incentive to self-regulate and make sure they only provide the best mechanism as to not retrospectively people then determine that these news organizations are gossip mongers to begin with. But two, there's also a huge number of editors they have to go to be able to disseminate such information internally anyway. So the kind of sources they provide are largely sensitive, and two, we think the kinds of sources they provide are credible to begin with. Why is anonymity important in cases like this? Because in cases where people want to whistleblow against governments or against governments, like in cases where you have leaked secrets or where you have spying going on, where you have a plane that's missing, we think anonymity is the condition in which much of this information is revealed towards news reporters anyway. Because that is the barrier that people need to prevent persecution onto them, or for making sure that governments don't lead witch hunts against them. And that is largely the kinds of contract that they are, largely the agreements they have with news corporations to want to reveal this information, because they have that moral dilemma of wanting to do the right thing but not bearing the consequence that could unfairly happen upon them by governments, Madam Chair. So we think that it's important to keep anonymity. We think it's important to not have anonymity as a precursor to these forms of information, because we need the dissemination of information. We need people to know so they can adjust their expectations of the behavior for the actions that happen. Like we saw the Malaysian public largely uncertain about their government's actions regarding the missing plane, simply because they did not know what was going on. They did not know what the government was doing in times like this. So people deserve their right to know so they can adjust their expectations, and it's the kind of stimuli that forces people to hold government accountable. So when we did start getting reports of the MH370, there was the exact same public demand that we saw in people forcing the governments to see what have you been doing and what exactly, or what have you been doing and what are the information that you're not generally telling us that provided the heat on the Malaysian government that eventually forced them to reveal information regarding the scandal or regarding the plane disappearance to begin with. And it revealed the incompetency of certain politicians, Madam Chair. And in order for that to happen, we do need people to leak information. We do need people to not bear the brunt of persecution. And that's why we think anonymity is important in these scenarios as well. So all in all, under both paradigms, Madam Chair, we think it's important for us to keep anonymity according to people. We think government has largely conflated the problem of identification and reliability, a thing that they have to sort out. For all these reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
We thank the opposition leader for his comments. Continue the case for the government. We invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Team Opposition Strategy. Let's make this a privacy debate. Let's forget the debate happening in PM. We don't think that's very nice of you. Try to engage a bit more with what Nishan said. Let's go through a few issues. Number one, people are more than willing to already be sources in the case of a flirt. We think that's perfectly fine. We think that's great. In instance where people are ready to come out with sources, we see no problem and we don't see how this harms our case, besides showing that's going to make it easier for the media to be able to get the sources faster and be able to report faster. So we don't see a problem there. Second issue, the idea that information access. What they're trying to say is that just because we put a source there, therefore it still makes it easier for multiple news reports to exist. We think that's true. We think that even if you allow for sources to exist, there can still be multiple various different and contradictory news reports, but we think we add an additional layer of security there. We allow people to discriminate the news report based on its source. So if I hear two contradictory stories, I can at least compare the source and decide which one seems more believable, considering one came from a government agency and one came from Fisherman Bob. So in this case, we think it's important that in the face of a flood of information, people have an additional tool to filter out what should they believe in and what should they not. We think that the access to information, even if it does happen outside, is not bad because at least we have the additional tool to filter that. What are you doing? The access of information still exists in your side, and we can't tell the difference between credible news and non-credible news. You need to tell us how people are going to be able to discriminate the information if everything seems to come from this magical anonymous source which I can never put a finger on. Tell us how individuals are actually going to get the evidence they need and are able to question the sources to make a proper decision. No, thank you. How about time sensitivity? You're accusing us of reporting after the flood has hit already. We don't think this is true. What they think is that the media is some kind of god, and whenever there's a flood, they automatically know it. And in our case, they have to go and find the source and then report. This is not true. How does the media find out stories? They go to the source, they find out information, they come back and they write the story. In our case, you're only going to spend a few extra minutes typing down your source in the article so people know who it is. It's not delaying things in any way. You're still going to need a source regardless of whether it's in our case or your case. The difference is, does the media reveal the source or not? In your case, they don't reveal the source. In our case, we reveal the source. Spend an extra 2 minutes. Make sure it's on the paper. No, thank you. Please take a seat. So we don't think we're going to kill people or make it extremely hard for the news to reach out there in time. Okay? How about the issue of privacy? They decided to make this a debate about privacy and anonymity. Fine, we'll engage on that grounds. Well, number one, we don't think the media will self-regulate. There's this kind of philosophy in media today. We have to deal with the specific modern media we're facing. To them, it's more advantageous to them to just get the story out there, make it very controversial, get a lot of publicity, and even if I'm wrong later, it dies down. There's not much blame put on me for giving out a false story. In this case, the rationale of the media is, I must report even if I don't have a credible source. I must report even if I don't get a good source because I want that first mover advantage. If I'm discovered to be wrong later on, well, the harms don't really, it's not really going to pull me down. Hence the reason why organizations such as Daily Mail still exist, why Utusan Malaysia still exists. They realize that the main thing that's going to keep them in business is getting the controversial story out regardless of whether it's well sourced or not. Even if it's discovered to be wrong later on, no harm done, right? But the second response to the issue of privacy is that whistleblowing without credible evidence is meaningless. It's inherently meaningless. Why is this so? How do you tell the difference between mere speculation when it comes to whistleblowing and an actual issue that deserves your attention? You are presuming that the source of your information chooses to remain anonymous, but at the same time is credible. At the same time, it's free from accusations, it's free from questioning, and for some reason, the source will definitely tell you the right story. We think that if you don't have a source, if you don't state that source, if you have no vested interest to tell the truth, you just won't have any incentive to do so to begin with. The third response is that we think we want people to stop hiding under anonymity. We think whistleblowers must be invested in the issue. This will make the difference between a person who's just trying to sell a few bucks to the media by becoming a whistleblower and a person who actually cares about what they're saying because it's their personal reputation at stake. Whistleblowing without actual credible evidence or actual sources is meaningless and doesn't do anything to change circumstances, be it whether it's a political scandal or MS-370, whatever. Please go on. Okay, sure. Though usually you sit down when you don't have a POI. Here's my issue for today. How can we make sources more accountable to the public and also to the media? Let's talk about the context of this argument. Number one, when it comes to the integrity of journalism, liability is mainly placed on the media agency. We don't really question the source. In the case of the whistleblower, we never question to see if the whistleblower is telling us the truth or is just trying to make some kind of ruckus or some kind of controversy to sell a buck to the media. But number two, when things go wrong, people put the blame on the media agency first. Of course, the media agency recovers very fast, but we are fine with this. We're fine with the media agency getting some blame, but we think the source of the information should also receive some share for the dispersion of false information. We don't think they can hide anonymously. So ultimately, we think it's important to place liability on the source information. We think that if you tell wrong information, if you disperse wrong information, there should be systems in place to make sure that the source has the public riled up against them. We think that's perfectly fine. Yes?
I mean, you can't have your cake and eat it. You can't say you want to streamline information to public so they can make better decisions, at the same time say there's not going to be absolutely any delay at all for them to cite their sources. Which one is it?
Well, we're not saying that we're going to streamline it. We're just saying that there's an additional filter that allows you to decide as a consumer of information whether this is a credible source or a non-credible source. We don't think it's going to slow down things. It's a very natural and logical thing to do. So the conclusion to the first context is that modern journalism needs to advance. It needs the public to be critical not just of the news, but the source of the news. That includes all your whistleblowers and all these anonymous people that spread news. What kind of sources are we talking about? Government agencies, NGOs, individuals on the ground, people, whistleblowers, or even other websites, or the imagination of the reporters. These are all sources of information that we need to put a light on to make sure they're accountable. So how do we make them accountable? Number one, when news is found to be false, individuals can immediately link it to the relevant source. In certain cases, the source gives information to multiple media agencies. So the media agencies aren't held credible, aren't held accountable. But in this case, the entire issue is just long gone because all the media agencies got it wrong. So let's not put the blame on anyone. What we're doing is putting the blame on the source. So it's number two. This means that the originating source of information cannot hide beneath the facade of a media agency. If I tell the media rubbish, I am to blame. Because I am the media agency is merely a link to revealing my information to the public. I receive the blame if I go wrong. Especially in the national crisis, the media wants any source of information they can get. And people are willing to give that, to be that source of information. They're willing to sell a few bucks to be that source. In our case, we make that accountable. If you want to make money for selling your information or you want to do an expose, you have to have a vested interest. You have to make sure that it's not just about giving your money to the media, getting money from the media. You also have to vested interest in defend your position and to make sure that what you're saying is true. We need to change the form of modern journalism where it's not just about the news, but also about the news source. We're very proud to propose.
Okay, thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his speech. To continue the case for the off-bench, we invite the Deputy Opposition Leader.
One of the scariest things that happened in the incident of the Korean ship, and I don't want to milk rhetoric power out of this, is that when the leaders in question did not tell the people on the sinking ship that it was about to sink, and people died as a result of that. I see it as a microcosm of what can happen within society, and we have seen that happening in the situation of MH370, whereby the rescue efforts were delayed because of a non-disclosure of information.
So a few points of contention. The first thing, and the primary concern coming from their side, is that there is an information thunderstorm and that we need to have some form of indicators to guide us, maybe perhaps a light post to guide us in such a situation. What do I have in response to that? Firstly, this point, like you rightly pointed out, is largely ineffectual because people will still go onto Twitter, or people will still use the anonymity of the internet to post this kind of information out there. But secondly, then this is when it becomes more interesting. So how do media players enter into the foil and add this information? Compare and contrast both sides. In our situation, even though you cannot reveal your sources, often the way the media gets attention to its particular report is to say that a certain high-ranking officer within the government, for example, or the company commented on that. Yes, it is impossible for us to verify the information right on the onset. But often, as the situation or the saga ensues, that when it becomes more and more easy for the media to reveal the information, or the anonymous source himself realize the national fervor on his side, then we can see that this information comes out even so. But it's in your situation that becomes problematic, because yes, it is possible that the media reporter go against the will of the whistleblower and expose this guy to unnecessary risk that he never consented to, which is immoral, because to begin with, right, you already had this kind of relationship with it, with the reporter, and a fear of trust. And secondly, that this will deter further whistleblowers or future whistleblowers, and this will cut off the source of information. Or the second situation, whereby these media reporters will be ethical and not reveal this information. In either situation, in the comparison, we see less information, and that there really is no resolution to your information thunderstorm that you talk about. The second thing that you put as a yardstick is that people need the fuller picture. And this is where I have to catch you at your bluff. Because how do you know that what the people don't know is not important? Because in this particular instance, the trade-off is that there will be some of these whistleblowers who will no longer go to a media organization, or they will force the reporters not to report this information, and that you're saying that, okay, but it's okay for people not to know what they do not know. That is problematic. But on the second level, there's a practical reason why this cannot be so. Because like what Kana mentioned earlier, sometimes government will eventually reveal this information, but they need the additional push from the people. But this push from the people will not materialize if the people do not know what they do not know. It's often when the first initial information is revealed, whereby the people will press the government, and the government is forced to respond because a critical question is being asked and its credibility is put at stake. And that is the exact example that we talked about, or we saw in MH370. Again, no response to that. So in terms of navigating an information thunderstorm, in terms of getting a fuller picture, a big problem out there. But the third thing, and this is the huge area of contention, is this. Can we assume that if someone doesn't want to be revealed as a source, therefore he is not a legitimate source? In fact, I think it is paradoxical that they even raise this up. It's often people who are in the most sensitive positions because they are in the highest ranking places where they have to sign non-disclosure act, whereby the penalties are the heaviest if they were to reveal this form of information, that has the most to lose as a result of that. And in this particular instance, it is because of their position, that's why they do not want to give to share their sources to begin with. For this group of people, two scenarios that happen. One is you expose them to unnecessary risk, which is unfair, because it's in our situation, if you tell a report in the news what they have said, but without revealing who they are, you give them an opportunity, for example, to seek political asylum overseas, but this option will automatically disappear under your situation. Or two, they will not participate with cooperate with you at all. So on all these three levels, we say that they are a useful source of information. Secondly, that the information thunderstorm can only be solved in our situation. And last but not least, it's not up to you to say what is the full picture that we win. Go.
You're talking about the best case scenario.
Yeah.
How about the majority of cases when whistleblowing amounts to mere speculation and causes an unnecessary upheaval among society? What's the check and balance towards that?
Yes, I'm glad you asked. The only check and balance is for more information for you to make this kind of comparison. Yes, just because, like for example, Guardian is approached by one of the insiders working in the Greek central bank doesn't mean that he will hold it as a gospel truth. And he can have cross-reference when more anonymous sources come to him. And in these particular instances, the entire media organization, because everything is at stake, right from the lowly journalist all the way up to the editor, will decide, bring up these kind of sources do we want to reveal this information to the public? But in your situation, if you have the threat that these whistleblowers will have their cover blown, there is a possible situation whereby a lot of these whistleblowers will still wait at the site. And if they were to wait at the site, it's very difficult at that point in time to really cross-reference this kind of information. Either that or the information will be delayed, and this is my point of substantive on why is it that we cannot entertain a delay in this information. I'm going to talk about a few things, right? The first thing I want to talk about is that information needs to be released early. Why is this the case? It is true that for most media organizations, it is in their incentive to negotiate, to cajole the sources to reveal their identity. Because like you said, it does add an additional measure of credibility when someone were to put his name on the newspaper. But this is a very touchy negotiation because the individual also has his own self-interest to consider at the same time. In such a situation, this touchy negotiation may take days, weeks, or even months, by which time the value of this information will have diminished considerably. For example, in the case of the MH370, time is of essence for three main reasons. Because firstly, your decision to act is directly dependent on the kinds of information. Your overseas partners also need this form of information to act on. Secondly, we say that because the public can use their demand for the politicians to become more transparent, to release even more information. And last but not least, we say that it is an important point that government's response to a crisis is always evaluated. The main problem in the MH370 crisis is this, is that it waited for 2 to 3 weeks before the official report was revealed to the public, by which time the public fervor has died down considerably. What is a very good opportunity for the Malaysian public to hold the government responsible is now gone because the golden window of opportunity is now missed. For all these reasons, we say information needs to be revealed now, that this lengthy negotiation will still take place anyway, but we still have an opportunity to reveal to the public.
Okay, we thank the Deputy Opposition Leader for his speech. To continue the case for the government bench, we invite the government whip.
Opposition tried very hard to create a parallel debate, one where we were actually debating whether or not anonymity was the right of whistleblowers. That wasn't the debate. There's a very good reason why the motion was worded as we would only allow reporting in the case of national crises if there was a source cited. They wanted to have this debate, assuming that someone wants to whistleblow on a political scandal or some other big issue, then we'll only allow that. No, we're not going to allow that, assuming that we don't have our paradigm. We'll let them be anonymous, whatever. So I'm going to take this on 3 grounds today. First, I'm going to talk about the actual debate where we deal with national crises. Then I'm going to talk about whistleblowing. I'm going to engage them anyway and show you why, even in their case, whistleblowing, firstly, isn't a necessary right in a democracy. And secondly, even if it was a right, why anonymity shouldn't be preserved in that case. Finally, I'm going to ask who does a better job and why we will decide that had a better conception of the debate as a whole. Firstly, what happens in national crises? Rishan was very clear from the start with his characterization of what a national crisis was. The problem is that they wanted to run away from that. Assuming that we accept their characterization, that we're talking about political scandals, my question would be, how is this a national crisis? Like, a politician having a sex scandal isn't exactly something that impacts the everyday lives of people. The fact that whistleblowers often deal with information that affects the highest echelons of power means that it isn't directly linked to be a national crisis. But let's engage with them anyway. Let's talk about MH370. They forgot one very important thing. Politicians and the people who act don't get their information from the media. In other words, all the inaction that they talked about with the case of MH370 wasn't caused because the public didn't have information about it. It was caused because the politicians, which had information about it, chose not to act on it. They don't get their news reporting from the media. They have all the intelligence necessary. In fact, it was very much political. And I resent the characterization that there was a lack of accountability. In fact, the Korean Prime Minister resigned over the ferry scandal. That sort of accountability that already exists, even under their best case scenario. So firstly, we reject the assumption that they made that no action happens because of the media. It's a large problem solution mismatch, because the kinds of people they're talking about don't get their information from the media. Before I go on, yes.
Okay, assuming we're talking about floods, the kinds of information reported is largely factual anyway. So you have research-based institutes, weather institutes providing the current information. Why do you need to cite sources from people around the world?
This was the distinction that they failed to make. There's either generally a truth that everyone agrees upon, which is the flood's going to happen, and the question is, which media sensationalizes the issue in order to gain more attention during that time of national crisis? That's one situation. The second situation is where people just lie because no one's sure what's really happening. That often happens for information, especially during times of national crisis. If you want to talk about things like war, sure, that also happens during that situation. So it's especially in those cases where you need your sources, because even if you don't censor the media, people should at least be able to discriminate based on where that information comes from. Let's deal with their topic. Whatever they wanted to debate about whistleblowing. Okay, their first general assumption was that people never assume those risks. Let's take this down. He came up here and very well characterized to us how they sign non-disclosure agreements, how they enter into contracts with other people, how other people's livelihoods are also depending upon what they say, how they're entering into mutual agreement with other people. Yet he tells us that it's legitimate to break all of those criteria on a whim and a fancy when we don't even know whether it's legitimate in the first place. Firstly, whistleblowing isn't necessarily a legitimate right in democracy. In fact, there's very good reasons why it isn't a legitimate right, especially when you consider that the information released in whistleblowing often has strategic importance beyond that which individuals can conceive, but governments can. But even if we assume that it was, we reject the characterization that you never assume those risks. If you know that you are releasing information that will get you prosecuted, if you know that your government doesn't want you to release that information, and if you know that the information has strategic importance to many people, then you do assume the risk when you release that information to the public against the wishes of everything you have legally contracted yourself not to do. So the characterization that you never assume those risks is false. But even if we assume their best case scenario, he gave you the answer in his speech. He told you that people release this on social media anyway. Very good. So if I have the option to anonymously release information on social media, if I can anonymously send poison pen letters to media corporations with the proof that they need, then why on earth would that be any different under our circumstance? If our side does this, we let the national issues where there's generally a consensus, if people want to whistleblow in those circumstances and they're willing to come forward and they know they have the support of the country, in those cases they wouldn't be scared. It's when they are scared that they know they're doing something that's probably wrong to the vast majority of the country. In those situations, that's where we make sure that if you aren't willing to take the flag and aren't willing to be accountable for what you're whistleblowing, then you shouldn't be releasing that information. Yes, Tim?
Can you tell me why a named source is far more credible than an unnamed?
Because, firstly, if your source is named, then during all legal proceedings, during all forms of discourse regarding that, we know exactly where that information came from, whether it was a leak of information that shouldn't have happened. We know whether information is either gossip and speculation or something that's actually coming from a very credible source. But secondly, in future, that source is accountable. I don't think it's unfair for you to say that, for us to say that if someone has a historical track record of releasing privileged information, then it's okay for people to assume that this is someone we generally can't trust. I don't think that's a risk that you can't assume. It's unreasonable of them to say that whistleblowing is some kind of sanctified constitutional right that everyone has. We think that people should be able to be accountable for this. But finally, weighed up, who had the more reasonable conception of this debate? Under their side, there was a very legitimate case to be made for the time sensitivity and everything else they talked about during times of national crisis. They shouldn't have gone the whole hog and tried to push the burden of whistleblowing onto us, especially when whistleblowing in of itself is a contentious issue that is very much debatable. So the question then becomes, in times of real national crisis, not things like sex scandals and political scandals, when people on the ground are affected by what is happening in your country during wars, during earthquakes, during floods, during those kinds of national emergencies, what then is the best way to achieve information veracity and for people to make the best possible decision in those circumstances. That answer comes on our side. They say we can't streamline information. That's not true. There is some streamlining that occurs, perhaps not the maximum level, but at least we make it better when we ensure that people who are randomly citing information for the sake of sensationalizing media don't get a chance to publish their stories. Under our side, even if there is information overload in a sense, people still get to decide, is the source credible or not? And the best part is they have future accountability. If I know that this source was not accountable in the past and told a lie, then in the future in similar kinds of national crises, then I have the ability to decide that this person has a track record of not giving us true information. I get to make a decision based on that. For all those reasons, because whistleblowing firstly wasn't the debate, but even if it was the debate, there's a myriad of reasons why these people shouldn't be anonymous. And because in the real debate regarding national crisis, it's far better to have credible sourced information, we are very proud to propose.
Yeah, he's having something going on.
You guys, are you guys the people who are applying for whatever it is exploded?
He was also things happening.
Yeah.
So we'll wait for you, man.
I don't know. You might be in the wrong.
Alright. We thank the previous speaker for his speech. To continue the debate for the off bench, we invite the opposition whip.
It was never about the moral merits of whether it was right or wrong for people who wanted to remain anonymous to provide information, whether whistleblowing was a moral benchmark that we needed to abide by or not. But from this previous speaker, it was largely contention from their end that they're not happy with people who want to provide information on an anonymous basis because it was something that was morally wrong. This sounds to me like a perfect platform to allow governments that are generally controversial to just muzzle people out of the system that they think shouldn't be in the public eye, anonymous or not. What I will do for you a couple of things. Number one, I'm going to tell you why do people choose to remain anonymous in times of national crises when it comes to providing information, why the media needs to have that reciprocal relationship with them. Secondly, why the media as an institution is already a self-regulating mechanism where it has to depend on its integrity and branding in order to continue its business, and therefore we think all the harms that they talked about are generally regulated already. And thirdly, what does this government model actually do in the long run? Because you stem out people who want to provide actual information, controversial or otherwise, on an anonymous basis, which we wouldn't have otherwise, and why we think that is fundamentally harmful. Firstly, why do people want to remain anonymous? Now, you have to understand, the first thing that's very important in this debate is the idea of integrity and protection. A lot of these people, these government officials, the people who work in aviation, generally don't want to harm their rights bowl, they don't want to tarnish their integrity, but they have relevant information to provide to the media. This is the reason why anonymity to these people who have these types of information are generally very, very important. It's because they've got something to lose at the end of it. And as media practitioners, there is already a common understanding of why we practice that form of anonymity, because we understand that there are special interest groups like this that exist. But secondly, even if these people intended to lie, number one, the fact-checking process of credible and of anonymous or identified sources is still the same. There are various sub-editors that you've got to go through. The fact-checking process of this is enormous. But secondly, the types of sources that media practitioners generally approach are the ones that are credible because their integrity is on the line as well as journalists. So we think lies, even if they may be, are easily weeded out of the system in that instance. But secondly, even if we go on the government model where this is not anonymous, we think the news can be just as faulty or just as untrue if people don't care about their integrity or don't care about their name. So we think that idea of reliability of the source is fundamentally harmful. The harm that government is proposing is this, that people are more willing to believe a certain amount of information if there is a named source. And we think that is fundamentally harmful because the credibility of the news is not heightened just because there's a named source on a particular article. And that was the presumption they made from the very beginning that we're not willing to stand by. What we would say, source that is named or unnamed still has to go through a rigorous fact-checking process in that instance, and we're happy to abide by that. But more importantly, if you're telling me that things like whistleblowing is wrong, where we can have legal repercussions, where we can find out where the news came from and stop these people, this is a perfect platform for illegitimate governments or governments that have something to hide to muzzle out people who have credible information, because we don't want to draw those moral benchmarks of what is right and what is wrong. Before I move on to why the media is a self-regulating mechanism, go.
The problem with fact-checking is that you're fact-checking against an anonymous source. When the source itself is the source of fact, how are you going to make sure information is right? Society must act upon a named figure so they can develop the issue further.
No, but why would the model, why would the action, the calculus change if it was a name figure? If it was based on proper facts that came from a governmental database, the fact-checking process would be still as rigorous and the rating would be still the same. Why would a person's action naturally change? You've got to come and tell me that which you didn't do. Secondly, why the media is a self-regulating mechanism? Media corporations, especially in times of crisis, operate on a first mover advantage because they've got their integrity to keep in place. They want to keep their branding. There is no incentive for them to put information that is untrue, or more importantly, approach unidentified sources which they generally think. So what I'm saying is they will never go to Fisherman Joe, but they'd rather go to meteorological departments because they want the best source of information, whether they name these sources or not. But secondly, we think the media practitioners, we don't know who these sources are, but media practitioners do. That's the whole point. Because the media is a self-regulating mechanism that needs to put as much true information out there in order to protect their brand and protect their integrity. The types of sources that these people generally approach are the ones that they trust themselves, and there's a reciprocal relationship that the people need to trust. The other thing that we also need to establish is that in times of crises, governmental priorities more often than not change. Therefore, information is generally curbed in order for the best public interest. But the question then becomes, can we always trust our governments to provide the best information or do what is best in terms of national security? That's when we think the most amount of information that we put out there is far better. Thirdly, under this model, if the information that was provided was generally untrue, we can easily prove the counterfactuals, because if the truth that eventually prevails can generally disprove the eventual lies that were provided by these media corporations, it's easily then to disestablish this. But the thing about the media is that it's so sensitive that the media distortion of any form of integrity is generally irreversible. And people who work in media corporations generally know this. So there's already an established incentive to not want to provide information that's generally untrue, even if these sources are generally unnamed. But lastly, what does this government model do? One, people who are willing to come forward under their model generally have nothing to lose. It means they either have information that is just not as contentious or not as controversial, or they want to provide information just for the sake of getting their 15 seconds of fame. What you lose, on the other hand, and which is what they're willing to concede, is information or intel that can't get out there because you put a blanket ban on people from reporting sources who want to help but don't want to be identified. What they cannot discount is that possibility, even if it's the smallest, that there's specific intelligence and specific information that can be provided to the media, that can be provided to people, that are generally beneficial and controversial to weed out the kind of insecurities that are happening that can't get out there because this is blanket ban on reporting that disallow reporting as a whole, which we think is unfair. But what did we tell you? Very importantly, that when untouched by Tevesh at the end, it's how you expedite journalism from what it is now, and the speed of journalism that needs to happen when it comes to national crisis. Because it's not just about the quality of information or the quantity, but it's the speed in which you get information out there to allow people to make those decisions in that instance. When you want to have credible sources, credibility doesn't necessarily come with just naming those sources in the first place. We think if people put their benchmarks of believing what is in the news, if there's a named source, it's generally problematic. What we think you discount in this debate, as far as governments are willing to do, is the trade-off that they're willing to make to let information and intelligence go by people who don't want to provide information if they get named. And we think that form of intelligence is very, very important, especially if it's true. But if it's not, we can weed it out eventually. We're very happy to approach.
We thank the opposition group for his speech. To close the opposition case, we invite their reply speaker.
The first question I want to ask is, what is the unique value add of naming figures? Secondly, about whether or not information has a multiplier effect and where do we start? And last but not least, are we fulfilling our duty as custodians of this information? So firstly, name figures, the unique value add. We need to see that name figures can come in two main groups. I don't want to simplify it, but they can be categorized in two main groups. Firstly, people who already volunteer information. If they were to volunteer information, this will work very well in our case anyway. but it's the situation whereby they are deceived or betrayed, whereby the media practitioners go against, like for example, their ethics, and then volunteer this information against their will. They will say that firstly, there's a morally controversy, and secondly, it will put off a lot of would-be whistleblowers in the process that we need to be very careful about. Because just because you get your first name source, after this, there is going to be a lot of updates about the similar situation, and you need the constant flow of information. But the last thing I want to say under the name figures is this. It's just because you put the name figures, like even if we take you at your best, all the harms will still happen. In fact, the best thing that you can do is a reactive stance whereby you go after that guy, but the information overload or the information confusion will have happened anyway. But compare and contrast that with our situation. It is true that in our situation, when people do not want to have their names on the newspaper, we are not going to do so. But why is it that we are still okay with it? A few reasons. Because firstly, if we have a constant flow of information and we are able to guarantee them and they are more forthcoming towards us, we are able to do fact-checking at the highest level. Fact-checking can take place on all levels. You can look at Twitter, you can look at Facebook, but the most important one is to be able to get like different points of view from these high-ranking officers, people who have the most to lose within those institutions. That was one of the strongest points coming from our side, but never once really responded under their situation. The second thing is this, is that it's not that journalists are too lazy, they do not want to put the sources over there. It's in my speech that I talked about how often there is this touchy negotiation that's taking place between the journalists and like these people, and it's difficult to convince them at the onset that they should put their names on the line out there. Maybe in the future they would, but by which time the information will be no longer as valuable. My point is that at the point at which it's important, speedy information is important. Again, a point never really once responded. The second thing I want to look at is this, information having a multiplier effect. This is something that, again, they didn't really fully understand. It is true that in the media thunderstorm, whereby more information is not very useful over there. To that, we already respond that having the media organization cite that they got this info from insider information and putting its entire organization's name on the line for the time being is sufficient. But secondly, we also have to take this debate into a consideration whereby some information is not revealed to the public to begin with. You do not know what you do not know. This is an important point, because if you want to create demand and force governments to be more accountable, at least you need a lead up to this. And often governments feel more compelled to reveal this form of information when a very direct and specific question was asked. For example, did you know that the airplane flew across the military radar radius out there? But governments will not face the same amount of pressure if this information was not even leaked out. We also talk about how information has a multiplier effect in terms of how these sources of information has to be shared with the foreign partners when it came to the rescue operation. This is where, in a very tangible manner, more information can very well guide the kinds of rescue operations. So on this level, we see that that even if we do not have this so-called name source, but this unnamed source is able to trigger off like governments to become more transparent out there. And if governments were going to be more transparent, it may very well open up more sources. Are we fulfilling our duty as custodians of information? Is yes. Because we already talked about, and this again went unchallenged, that most media organizations have their long-term reputation at stake, right? They do have this self-checking mechanism, and not just a lowly journalist making a decision on his own accord. So for all these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, that firstly, that this unique value add really is marginal. Secondly, we need to trigger off this multiplier effect. And last but not least, because we got information in a more honest and a sustainable manner, go to the side of opposition.
We thank the opposition reply speaker. To close the government case and this debate, we invite the government reply.
So in the Hurricane Katrina of the debate that we just saw, the question we put forward to you is dodgy information better than no information? Now they lost this debate primarily because they decided to create a new one. They somehow forgot that there was a word national in the motion. We told you from the get-go, this debate doesn't occur in small political or business scandals that you see in the news every day, where lots of parties have different incentives and they're all vying to protect those incentives. We told you at the get-go, in my characterization, that this debate occurs in huge national crises where all your previous incentives and petty political and business incentives are overridden by the situation. And that's why we particularly like the national disaster analogy, because it affects us all, ladies and gentlemen, from top down. You could be living in a mansion, be the biggest Mac Daddy politician on the block, but the national crisis will affect you in the same way that it would me, a hobo off the streets. So we told you that that's where the debate occurs. We are not going to let them get away with it simply because they didn't say national crisis. In fact, in his reply speech, the fact that he didn't even say the word national or crisis demonstrates to you what different debate they wanted to come up with, and that is the true crisis here. They're blatantly lying to you. Don't let them get away with that. But what they wanted the debate to be about was privacy. And we are a respectful, wonderful team that were generous enough to engage on that. We told you from the outgo in my speech that dodgy whistleblowers can never happen in us. The fact that perverse incentives for people to come forward and dodgily whistleblow, sell a buck to the media, like Aaron puts it brilliantly, to get their 15 minutes in shame, or just in fame, and just be an awesome source, or to mess things up from strategic reasons, doesn't occur in us. And this idea was progressed brilliantly in Aaron when he told you about the accountability and transparency of sources. Currently, sources are just too invisible. And that's what they want to defend. They allow sources huge amounts of anonymity to say whatever they want, whenever they want, because they will never be questioned about it. We think, at the end of the day, it is about the morals of a whistleblower. Because a true whistleblower are individuals who are willing to champion their ideas if they truly believe they are true ideas. And if, in Malay, we have this proverb, berani kerana benar, which means if you're right, you're brave. So these people know that what they got is gold, and they're willing to go out and put that there regardless of all the harms they want to bring about. That's why nothing in this world could have got Edward Snowden to keep quiet. No threat of jail or castration could have stopped him from going and doing what he did. And that is the beauty of whistleblowers, that can still happen and that we rather champion. But look at it this way. Whatever you want to do also, we have witness protection, and the argument is to toughen that up. And we can protect them. Now, they fell out of the debate in the huge parts of their first two substantive speeches dealing with that. But credit where credit is due, they still talked about time delay, and they came back in the debate a bit. Now, we told you, you can quickly type out a source, so there isn't a real time delay. But the time delay that they wanted to hint at was that the media companies have to cajole the source. They have to spend lots of time trying to get the information out of the source. That sounds like very dodgy information. That sounds like the media company just wants a story and they're willing to go and cajole some random fisherman to get that story. So there is no time delay, ladies and gentlemen. What was the debate really about? You cannot ignore that we have done important things. One, we did the accountability of sources. We proved to you that sources can now have a track record, and we no longer have to depend on gossip and speculation for our news. Sources can be judged based on who they are and why they are. They try to tell you that who is saying what should never occur in your rational calculus. But ladies and gentlemen, basic epistemology, half the truth is who says it. Half the fact of something is the person that says it to be, because different people have different fields of expertise. A fisherman obviously doesn't have the same amount of expertise and oversight as a meteorological department that has done the research that they did. So in the end, we proved to you a track record. We proved to you more accountable news, and we proved to you that more accountable news is important, because at the end, this debate is about the philosophy of media companies and the power they have over individuals. We wanted to return the power to individuals to make the best possible decision with the best possible information. That only happens under the true whistleblowers of this debate. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone. Please cross the house. We need to remove statements.
It's been an honor debating with you. Do you want to stop the podcast? Oh yeah, you should just hit the button.
Cheers, guys.
Hey, it's been an honor.